Hello everybody, my name is Jatnos, and wow, we have some big news today. So an update on Shadowlands was posted by Blizzard while I was asleep, so that's why this video is like 2 hours later than it normally would have been. And the big news here is that Shadowlands is getting delayed. It's getting delayed to an indefinite time, although at some point still this year. So the range has been opened from before they announced it to be October 27th. And now, if this is accurate, it'll be sometime between October 27th and the end of the year. Probably not. We'll speculate more about the actual date a little bit later and some of the other ramifications. But I guess let's just get started off by talking about if this is a good or bad thing. I think a knee-jerk reaction from a lot of people is disappointment that Shadowlands isn't coming out as soon as possible. Particularly disappointment that BFA is going to continue for longer, even though it'll be in the pre-patch, which is coming out on the October 13th date that they've also announced in this thing. So that is in 12 days' time, we'll get our pre-patch out. But we'll be in that pre-patch now for a while. Now, if the 27th had been the release date, this actually would have been the shortest pre-patch in the history of World of Warcraft, I believe. There's this Wowhead article here that has the amount of weeks of pre-patch for each expansion, and the shortest up until now had been 4, and now we would have been going into a 3-week pre-patch phase. Now we could potentially be going into the longest pre-patch ever, and we're expanding on an expansion that was already going to be one of the longest ever. I think it was already the longest expansion ever, to potentially even longer in that space. But I think those disappointments aside, this is a really, really positive sign for Blizzard. This is a decision that almost certainly isn't motivated by money. I mean, I've always been of the opinion that you make the best game possible, you make the best decisions for the game possible, and the money will come as a result of that. That's kind of my whole philosophy with videos and everything as well, is you try and make the good content first, and the money will come as a result of having made the good content, rather than if you try to optimize for making the money, and you don't make any good content along the way, what are you doing? And I think that this is potentially a show of that philosophy coming out of Blizzard as well, because I think historically, most of us players, me in particular, I thought that this was not something that was remotely realistic. I was of the opinion that a delay like this, when they've already announced a release date, would be just too much money lost, or at least would appear to lose too much money to the corporate people at Blizzard for this to be a decision they'd consider making. So, I'm really actually excited to see this change. And I think it opens up the door to potentially see some further changes like this, right? A Blizzard that is firm on this kind of release date is also more likely to just stick to their guns on stuff like Covenants, whereas one that is willing to make this pushback of an expansion is also, I think, one that is more willing to, take a risk and maybe listen to a bunch of player feedback and adjust systems like that, if not in 9.0, at least in 9.1, right? I think the odds that if there's big kind of outcry about it, that it'll get fixed sooner, is really favorable with this. So let's talk about some of the other implications of the new release date. Now, let me pull up the calendar here. So the 27th was the original release date that was scheduled for the expansion. And then that meant the raid was going to be coming out. Heroic Week, I think, was going to be the 10th. And Mythic Week was going to be the 17th, leading to a very likely Thanksgiving overlap for many American players, because, of course, Thanksgiving would have been on the 26th for Americans. This leads to some interesting questions because, okay, first of all, let's talk about when the new release date might be. Let's assume it's going to be a Tuesday, because it usually is a Tuesday. It could be a Monday as well. It'd be basically the same thing, but we'll just talk about the Tuesday dates. If it's Tuesday the 3rd, I think we can rule that out because you incur a pretty big cost as a company by announcing a pushback. I think you're likely to do that, to not just do that for only 1 week, right? Like if you only needed an extra week to make the game ready, I think they would have probably just bitten the bullet and released it at the original time. I would be surprised to see it come out on the 3rd. So I think we can rule that out. For similar reasons, I think the 10th can probably be ruled out as well. So I think that means that an expansion launch in like the 17th range is probably the earliest of the reasonable amounts now, given that we've seen this. Expansion launch on the 17th would be kind of interesting. Although for players that have booked time off, already booked time off for this 17th period, for the 7th or 27th period of October, the 17th of November might still be tricky for them. to get that time off for. But there's Thanksgiving coming up soon for the American players that would potentially give them some days to play the new patch. And that would give us something like a heroic week on maybe the 1st and a mythic week on the 8th. And then for, world first guilds, progression would be done by Christmas. But for non-world first guilds, this would mean very much a Christmas in the middle of progression tier, even for like world top. Yeah, everybody outside of the world top 5 to 10 would likely still be in progression given historical patterns, unless they make another Emerald Nightmare where the boss dies in the first week for everybody. Then that would be, I think, the overwhelming likely situation. So I hope that that's not something that they do. There are two different ways that they could solve this, right? One thing they could do is they could just release the game later. So they could release the game up to the 29th. I would be very shocked to see the 29th. I think that the 22nd is probably the most likely day that they would release, the latest reasonable date for them to release, because the 29th, you just have it coming out after the holiday, like after Christmas. If you do the 22nd, people can still get it for people for Christmas, and I think a lot more people would. So I think that for that reason, I would expect to see the 22nd more than 29th. But I think any of these December Tuesdays would be reasonable times to release the game, regardless of when they release it between, say, November 17th and December 22nd. I hope that they consider pushing the raid back to the 5th of January. And that way we just don't have to deal with it being over the holidays at all. Now, there are some players who get to play more during the holidays, and for those players, the expansion's there, right? Like the Mythic Plus is there, you can play the game, but actually organizing a raid of players to go and do a raid over the holidays is a nightmare for everything above. Like it's maybe better for certain, normal or heroic situations. If you're the kind of player who doesn't normally have time to raid, but might over the holidays, you might actually prefer heroic to be released in such a time, like over the Christmas break, so that you could actually go and do the heroic raid. But for most players that play with any degree of coordination or try to play with a guild or anything, the last time we had a tier happening over the holidays was Taurus, and it was a little bit of a pain to try and coordinate people over these days, right? It was, for most guilds, it was not a question of like, are you going to be able to raid your full schedule? It was more a question of, okay, which days are we losing? How bad is this going to be? Do we have one guy who's taking off, the week before Christmas, and one guy who's taking off the week after Christmas, and so we can't raid either of those weeks? That was kind of a miserable position to be in for a lot of guilds. So that is one big question mark for me, is what are they going to do with the raid? And the reason that's such a big question mark for me is that the raid looks sweet. The raid, from the raid testing I've done, every single boss now I think looks great. The boss that I was most sketched out by was the Council of Blood, and that boss they've now tested 4 times, and each time the boss has gotten better. The newest version of it, I actually think, looks like it'll be a fun boss. So every single boss in that raid, I think, is going to be somewhere on the spectrum of good to super duper epic. And that means for me that I hope that they release it in such a way that we get to experience the raid. Because if it does come out in the Christmas holiday time, if this falls in the middle of progression, that'll put a bit of a damper on my enthusiasm for the raid, because it just kind of scuffs the competition a little bit. So hopefully that's something that they will consider doing. I hope that I think that regardless of when you hit this release date, it's actually kind of flexible, and they should consider just pushing the raid back to the Tuesday, regardless of which of these days they release the expansion on. Okay, so that's one thing about the expansion. Let's talk about some of the other things that this kind of mindset might mean from Blizzard. So as I was talking about earlier, this is the kind of decision that looks like it is the developers, the people that want the game to be good, the people that actually work on this game, that have pushed for this to happen because they think that they need to do it to make the game as good as possible. My original opinion on this was actually that, for the most part, things that you needed more time for were looking fine in Shadowlands. Things that you need a lot of time to do, or like simple bug fixes, or that kind of list of stuff I thought was getting done at a pretty reasonable pace in the beta. Over the past couple months since I developed that opinion, they've kind of slowed down, so it makes sense they need a little bit more time for that. The one thing that I'm a little, I don't know, I feel like there's a lot of celebration of this from players that, the big complaints that a lot of the players who've been really celebrating this pushback had, I still think are pretty unlikely to be changed. I think they've gone from being like 0% to get changed to having a reasonable percentage, but I think that this is still something that is unlikely to cause, if you're a player who's been looking at the conduit system or the covenant system or the AoE cap, and you've been looking at those things and you've been like, this is you know, this is something that I think is a big issue. I still would be surprised to see them, you know, change how those systems operate between now and Shadowlands release. But I think it is now a possibility. So I'm now going to attempt to make that case to any of the Blizzard employees that may be watching. The reason I'm going to try and make this case is because if you go back to the Watcher post from a couple weeks ago talking about covenants and stuff, there's actually this line in here. Covenants are the centerpiece of Shadowlands and have been the subject of passionate discourse across the community over the past weeks, which has been mirrored by discussion and debate within our team. So there are people within the team that know what's up, right? There are people within the team that are the heroes here that need our help. And so those people, let me try and give you some ammunition to bring your arguments in those meetings inside Blizzard to try and get covenants into a better state before this launch comes out. Because if you look at what's been happening over the most recent beta builds, it's been a very consistent story. Let me show you what that's been. Okay, so here's the Microsoft Paint graph. This is going to be a graph of covenant ability power level based on the covenant. And we'll do this for 2 different specs that have had recent tuning changes just in the past couple days on beta. So let's start off with Rogue. So the y-axis here is going to be power level, right? This is power level. Up here is like super duper epic button. Up here is like good button. Here's like meh. And then here's a button you don't push. Right? Something that goes onto your hotbar but doesn't ever actually get used would go down here. Okay? Now, in previous builds of the Shadowlands beta, this could reasonably look something like this. I guess I should put in a solid color fill here. Hang on. So this was, the Kyrians were there. The Necrolord ability was like actually pretty great. Okay, this is a nightmare. I have to change this twice. Okay. All right, I got a new idea. I'll fill it in later. Actually, I can do this. I'm a paint expert. And the Night Fae ability was kind of like was also kind of somewhere around there. And the Venthyr ability was maybe like up here or something. So this was kind of what Rogue was looking like for the most part in previous builds of the Shadowlands beta. About 2 weeks ago, or actually a little bit more than that ago, they kind of did. They kind of went like this to the spec, and then in the most recent build they were kind of like, whoop, let's get Necrolord out of here. And this is kind of my thing about balancing the covenants is it is very, very, very hard to balance the covenants and have them all be up here in the super duper epic button range, right? If you need to balance the covenants because you can't swap between them, it's almost impossible to have them up in the super duper epic button range, because something that is a super duper epic button in one form of content is going to be just blatant. Like, even if you can keep everything competitive in one form of content, things that are that good are just going to be, there's going to be one form of content where there's going to be huge discrepancies, right? But one way you can make them balanced, and this is what Blizzard is doing for Rogue, it's also what they're doing for Warlock, is you just take everything and you bring it down to the meh or lower tier, right? If you bring it down to the meh or lower tier, you can make these buttons work and actually be balanced. And a lot of people are saying you can't balance covenants. I think you can. I think you can balance covenants. You just can, you in order to do it, you have to make the abilities not fun anymore. That's what we're seeing over the current iterations on beta right now. And I think it's a shame. I think that it can be fixed, though. I think you can bring back the abilities to the point where they're super duper epic buttons. You can make it so that one of them is like completely unbelievably good in a couple different situations, and then there's another one that's good in like one of those situations, and then another different situation, right? Like you have a button that just owns in Mythic Plus and PvP, and a button that owns in Raid and Mythic Plus. Those buttons can coexist together, and players that, like me, can be excited about all those existing if we can swap between them. If we can't swap between them, then it stops being like there's a super duper epic button, and it starts being like, you know, instead of talking about where on this graph things are in a given form of content, instead we're going to be talking about the discrepancies between them. But if you can swap between them, that stops mattering, right? It'll be allowed to have a big difference between these abilities. So my evidence for this is Rogue. This happened with Warlock as well. If you want to see what happened to Warlock, Warlock in previous builds was looking like their Necrolord was kind of sweet. Their Venthyr was also pretty sweet. Their Kyrian was reasonably good. Oops. I did the wrong thing here. Hang on. Oh no, dude. Okay. Oh, this is a disaster. Okay, I got it this time. There it is. and then the Kyrian one. Okay, I've deselected it this time. Yeah, there we go. So this was what Warlock was looking like on beta up until this most recent set of changes, right? And again, Warlock has received that same treatment the Rogue did, where, right, everything just gets put to the point where the abilities are no longer up in this tier of power level. Now, I don't know. I mean, like, on the one hand, this is a way to balance things. This will be better than the discrepancies. Like, this is better than that previous system if the covenants aren't swappable, but there's still time now. Because they pushed this back, there's still time. There's still time to fix this. They can do it, right? You can buff these abilities back. You can make them extremely powerful and impactful if you just let us swap them. And we're okay with some grind. I'm okay with some grind. I don't know if everybody's okay with some grind, but I'm okay with a little bit of grind if it's grind to unlock a second and third and fourth covenant on my main character, and it's grind that I can do at my own pace over the whole expansion or whatever, and I don't have to do it if there's a covenant I don't feel like I ever want to use, or two covenants I don't feel like I ever want to have to use. I'm okay with doing that, because that to me is so much better than the permanent problem of not being able to swap, right? Like, of not being able to play two different covenants in the same week. Now, there are some ways around this. There are some ways around the covenant system. I think they're stupid, but they're doable. What you can do right now is you can, like, bank up a covenant swap quest, and then you're still your first covenant, and then you turn in that covenant swap quest when you want to later. Or you can just make a new, like, so say you play a Death Knight for Castle Nathra progression, and you swap between, Night Fae, Kyrian, and Venthyr for different fights. You want to be Venthyr for one of the fights for just because you can't get a good Death and Decay because there's a lot of movement, and you want to be Kyrian for one of the fights because you want to have that flask to remove bleeds, and so you swap between all three of those covenants a little bit for progression, and then you're looking at the next raid and you're like, oh no, because I've beaten each of these covenants once, if I want to swap to them, now it's going to take a weekly quest, whereas before it wouldn't have. You can just roll up a new Death Knight once you're done with Castle Nathra progression and never swap covenants on it. And then the next raid tier, you again have that no cooldown swap because, of course, your first one is free, right? Your first swap to a given covenant is free. So there are some ways around this that high-end players will maybe consider doing. I think they're stupid, but also I'll do them if it's what I need to do. But I feel like I don't know. I feel like it's not too late. I feel like the Blizzard that delays this game here, the Blizzard that puts out this post, is maybe a Blizzard that is willing to have a rethink here, because we're really not that far from the best expansion of all time, right? This is so close. The raid boss fights have looked so unbelievably good across, like, the amount of raids that I would describe as the amount of raid bosses in Castle Nathria from testing that look like they're going to be 9 out of 10s or better is unbelievable. It's unbelievable how many of those fights look good. So with just a tiny little bit of tweaking to Covenants, I think this would be the best expansion of all time. If not Covenants, all right, I respect we might not get Covenants. We might not get them until 9.1. At least let's think about conduits, right? The way that conduits work right now on beta is you can swap them once per week. Think of conduits like minor essences, basically, or Azerite traits. In fact, they're very similar to Azerite traits in terms of what a lot of them do. But you can only swap between them on a given soulbind tree once per week. This leads to a couple of weird spots. For instance, the first couple weeks when you get your upgrades, say you go into a heroic week with like a 187. You have a 187, a rank 3 or whatever conduit, and then the first day of that week you do some Mythic Plus, and you get a 194 conduit because you did a plus 7, right? And you're like, oh sweet, I'm gonna slot this in now. It's better, right? It's a couple ranks higher. It's better even though it's a different conduit. And then you do another dungeon, and you get an item level 200 because now you're doing a higher level key. So you get an item level 200 conduit, and you're like, sweet, this is even better. And you can't actually swap that one in. You can't swap that in until next week. Or if you did the raid, and you got a 213, you got a rank, you did heroic raid, you got a rank 6 conduit, and you're like, this is great. This is a huge upgrade. The fact that you slotted in that 194 over the 187 conduit earlier in the week means that you're not going to be able to do any further swapping for the rest of the week. You're there, you get this upgrade, and you're like, I can't swap this. So hopefully, at least they consider making it so that you get a free swap to anything that drops. Like, if you drop a new conduit, you can just slot that in anywhere, ignoring the 1 week CD. That I think would be the minimum for this to not be really, really stupid. But they could just remove the 1 week CD. Just remove the 1 week CD. Just let us swap our effectively Azerite traits or artifact traits or minor essences. Just let us do that swap at will, because we played the first version of Azerite armor where you couldn't do that, and everybody hated it, and everybody's gonna hate it this way too. So those are my passionate pleas to to whatever members of the team are out there that are still involved in this discussion and debate, stay strong. You guys are the real heroes out there. Whatever people at Blizzard are causing there to be discussion and debate about these issues, you can do it, right? You've already won this thing. This is a huge win for those sorts of devs. This is a huge win, I think, for the community that is looking for a game to come out polished, is looking for a game to come out and have it be good, rather than just have it come out and then eventually be good after it stopped mattering. So yeah, those are my takes. This is good news. This is a good change. It means that there's possibility for other changes that I thought were impossible to maybe be possible again. There's a glimmer of hope here for a lot of things. And Shadowlands could easily be the best expansion of all time with some very, very, very small tweaks. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Remember to hit like and subscribe and stuff. Thanks everyone for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.